with us as special guest. Nouman Asharaf is an assistant professor at the Rotman School of Management, and he is a thought leader in equity, diversity, and inclusion. We welcome him to this special presentation. I know it'll be a delight. I've had the pleasure of hearing your presentations at CBC, where I work. And following Nouman's presentation, no stranger, of course, to our audiences here in Toronto, is Farah Nasser, global news anchor. And Farah will host a special Q&A with you all following the presentation. So thank you very much, and welcome to both.
Thank you, Joanne. Hello, hello. So I want to begin by, wait for it, acknowledging the land on which we're meeting today. This land on which the Sheraton Hotel sits has been, is, and always will be sacred land to our Indigenous peoples, to the Huron-Wendat, to the Anishinaabe, to the Seneca, and most recently to the Mississaugas of New Credit River. I say this not only because it's one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I think where I come from, which is the University of Toronto, universities and many, in fact, cultural institutions like yourselves exist only for two reasons. Reason number one, knowledge or cultural creation, and reason number two, knowledge and cultural mobilization. We can neither speak of knowledge creation nor of knowledge mobilization or cultural creation or cultural mobilization until and unless we understand and acknowledge the knowledge systems and the cultural norms that came before us. I ask you, that I ask myself every day, to ask the question, what's going to be my play today? How am I going to get myself a little bit closer to reconciliation? And that's part of our conversation today. Are we on, folks? You switch me over? Thank you. No, that was pretty quick. So let's get started.
Hello, Nouman. Hello, Nouman. Hello, Nouman.
It's not Nouman.
It's not.
Hello, Nouman. Hello, Nouman. Nouman!
It's Nouman.
It's true.
It's not Nouman.
Nouman!
It's Nouman. Not Nouman. It's Nouman. Nouman. Hashtag hustle.
All right, that's me. So please don't call me Nouman in the Q&A period. A bit of a play on something that I think is quite normal, which is this idea of what do we do when we don't know how to pronounce the name of that person that we're about to interview, interact with, or have known for, gosh, how many months down the hall, but we're afraid to ask for the right pronunciation. I actually think that's really important as we begin this conversation. So 5 ideas about why inclusion matters. The first thing about inclusion isn't about perfection. It's not about getting every consonant of my name right. It's about doing the opposite, which is to say, how do I make an honest effort to understand how he would like to be addressed, how she would like to be addressed, how they would like to be addressed? Why does that matter? I hope this conversation, this dialogue, gets us out of this trap of perfection. Because I don't think actually inclusion works when we actually aim for perfection, because to me, perfection is a mirage. Instead, it's about these 3 things. It's about awareness. How do we come into our work? What's our responsibility? It's about intent. How do we think about who's not here and why? And it's about skill. What are the skills that we need to get out of our own comfort zones? To what end? The end is always how do we live out our purpose? I think in education and in the cultural industry, we can hardly afford the luxury of missteps day to day. Why do I say that? So this is a picture of me leading the academic procession at the Rotman School. This to me is not purpose. That's pomp and circumstance. That's tradition. That's not purpose. So what's purpose? In your work, what's your daily purpose? Not a rhetorical question. When I ask a rhetorical, yeah, I want answers.
Encouraging people.
Thank you, and you are?
I'm Jill.
Jill, give me 5.
Nouman.
Very good, thank you, Jill. So it's encouraging people, and why is that your purpose, Jill? Excellent, oh my goodness, another one. That's what leaders do, right? Give it up for Jill. Okay, 2 more people. Reflecting community, and you are, sir? Makai, how come? Not Kawhi, because he's on Sunday, but not. Okay, yes. Come on.
Because that's, as journalists and as storytellers and as people charged with trying to be inclusive in our communities,
Right.
we are supposed to reflect the interests of our community and people we serve.
And even if we don't reflect, I think we have to at least go here. We have to learn about our communities, right? If this is our land, then where are our stories? One more person? Purpose? We've gone center, we've gone right, left flank over there, anywhere? What's your purpose? Yes, please. To inform, and you are? Hayden. All right. So Hayden, what's the deal with to inform? Okay. Excellent. And do we do that as bystanders? Do we inform as kind of inert, objective, nonpartisan individuals, or are we in the mix? Okay. Okay. So social location is really important. Like, where do we actually do this work? And that, to me, is this idea of how do we amplify the voices of the ones that we interact with? In particular, the voices of the ones who haven't seen themselves represented in the media regularly. And lastly, my favorite thing about purpose is when purpose is done well, it's all about iteration. So iteration is a design concept. What do we get at the end of an iteration cycle? If you think you're just going to sit quietly, it's the wrong room. I'm sorry. Right? I don't do monologues. But I should also tell you, in my sessions, there's no such thing as a stupid answer. Only stupid people. Just kidding, relax. Making sure you're all comfortable. Just making sure you had your, whatever you needed. Coffee, tea, vodka, martini before you got here. What do you get at the end of an iteration cycle? Reflection? Okay, tell me more, please. And you are? I'm Larry. Larry? How you doing? I'm good. How are you? Pretty good. Okay.
I think after every time you pivot or iterate something, you want to look back to see what
Nice. Okay, good. So what's that thing you're looking back at? That's what I'm asking you, Larry. What's that thing? It's a version of something, yes? Good. And that we call a prototype, right? And some people call that a beta. Before you have the real thing, you have a beta. I think inclusion requires for us to live in beta. It requires for us to have a little bit of distance between ourselves and our final product, because there is no such thing, right? When we have this iteration mindset, we constantly ask the question, how would this story play out if we actually spoke to 5 different people? How would this product or service, net out if we actually had different focus groups? Why does that matter? To me, this idea of perfection, and oftentimes people think about inclusion as what I call the lingo bingo, right? If I have the right pronouns, if I call them racialized and not minorities, if I call them, not gays, but members of the LGBTQ community, I actually think it requires something different. It requires for us to have a growth mindset. If we keep talking about communities as them and ourselves as us, we haven't grown a heck of a lot. And I think that when you give yourselves this idea, this permission to grow, right, the central question we have to ask ourselves is this: what's our reaction to making a mistake? What's our reaction to failure? And most of the time we think of failures as being career-limiting moves. And that sort of mindset is just pure BS. And of course by that I mean bold statement, right? Instead what we need to do is to ask the question, what did I do wrong? Raise your hand if you've actually made a mistake interpersonally, and when you've been called out on it, hold it now, you've focused on your intent. I never intended to actually make you upset, to cause you offense, to come across as a racist, and so on. So if you're actually on Twitter, earlier on today, one of your panelists took a picture of one of your panels and said, I get it, we don't look like Canada. And someone else retweeted that saying, great, a mostly white male panel talking about diversity, excellent. Like, please discuss. And the person got back and said, well, this wasn't the topic of the panel, I'm just making, I'm just being self-reflexive, da-da-da-da-da-da. What are they noticing? Yeah, so diversity as it's represented by physiognomy, what they can actually see. And this is where I actually think we need to move our conversation into this idea. Inclusion is about recognizing the impact that we have. The impact that we have, not simply because of things we've done, but also things we could have done or can be doing in the future. This is the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Jane Goodall, who reminds us that what we do already makes a difference. We've just got to decide what kind of difference we want to actually have, what kind of difference we actually want to make. So let's get real about this. Ta-da! Congratulations, young Archie. Yes, everyone's excited about this? Yes, excellent. And then we have this tweet that came from a DJ that works for the BBC. Royal baby leaves hospital. Yeah, he doesn't. So this is actually his next tweet. Right? The call to fire me from BBC 5 Live was a masterclass of pompous faux gravity. Took a tone that said, I actually meant that ridiculous tweet, and the BBC must uphold blah, blah, blah. Literally threw me under the bus. Could hear the suit's knees knocking. Fuck 'em. Sorry, auntie. Right? What do you make of that tweet? Yeah, defensiveness. Right? That too. But then again, who here has not sinned with bad grammar on Twitter? I certainly have. Right? 280 characters. Yeah, for sure. But keep going. So he comes back. He clearly got a PR agent. Right? This is this morning. Good morning, everyone. Following one of the worst days of my life, I just want to formally apologize for the outrage I caused and explain how I got myself into this mess. I chose the wrong photo to illustrate a joke, disastrously so. What are they talking about here? What's my intent? What was my intent? Right? But they have a good PR agent, because watch what happens next. Minutes later, I was alerted by followers that this royal baby was, of course, mixed race, and waves of panic and revulsion washed over me. Fuck, sorry, auntie. Right? What had I done? I needed no lessons on centuries slurs equating simians and people of color. Racism at its basest. Okay? Anyway, I'm not paying the price for this crass and regrettable blunder, and rightly so. Probably even this final word for me will extend the mania. Dog whistle, anyone? I'd like to thank friends on here for their kinder words, and once again, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Woe is me, right? Now, I have, none of us in this room, right, have any kind of technology that can actually intuit how sincere this apology is. So just so you know, I'm a redemptionist. I think everyone should be given a chance or a shot at redemption. But I think, can I go back for a second? There seems to be a big difference between this kind of Twitter rage and the final one that I showed you. What do you think happens when we go back and forth like this in a public forum? We lose credibility, we lose trust, people think how disingenuous we may or may not be. I actually think, to quote, Peter Parker's uncle, Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. It's certainly true for me. When I have the kind of podium at the university, it's true for all of us here in this room who enjoy fanfare in the media. If I were to ask you, name for me one of the most innovative companies in the world, who would you tell me? Apple, who else? Google? This is Google. Let's watch this for just like 3 minutes.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TV Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable. Because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm gonna hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're gonna make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong, but it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
What'd you hear? Try different, yeah. Step out of yourself. But there's something else. You actually have to know yourself to be effective. You've actually got to know what the potholes are in your imaginaire, as the French call it, in your psyche, in your intellect. This is not just Google. This is Google Venture. Sorry, it's GV. Everything in Google now is an alphabet. So Google Venture has the following mandate. We want to pick up technologies and startups that haven't actually IPO'd and get them before the rest of the people can. And the person who runs GV had a problem. He kept missing these deals. So he was at a talk where a colleague and friend of mine, Mazrin Banaji at Harvard, who's I think, the world's most important academic in the area of unconscious bias, she said, why don't you take the implicit association test at Harvard? You go online, you can all do this. And his implicit association test results showed him that he equated competence with male and way lower scores for females around competence. He was like, this is just nonsense. I don't have this bias. So he says, I'll hire a consultant, a coach. And so he does. The coach uploads a software on his device that actually looks at all of his contacts. 90% of his contacts are males, 10% are females. Well, that's the tech center. That's the sector in which I play, he says. All a bunch of bros doing great stuff. He says, okay, the next level of analysis is, how much do you actually use your contacts? 98% of his activity, other than family, is with males. He says that's baloney still. He asked the coach to actually follow him around in his meetings. And the coach says, oh, by the way, the level of how often you interrupt females in meetings versus males, 3 to 1. Right? The number of times you ask people to do admin tasks, almost entirely female. Just saying. Here's where I don't want you to go from this conversation. Because the conversation about unconscious bias is not a conversation about you, it's a conversation about us. I have them. You have them. Because we're human. But what it doesn't do is, it doesn't let us off the hook and say, well, we're all screwed collectively, so therefore we can't do anything about it. I'll tell you where we have to go. We've got to move away simply from, or get beyond diversity, right? I'm clearly fasting and hungry, as you can tell. All my slides will now have food from here on in, right? We've got to move from what I call diversity by default. I'm going to pause here for a second. So if you're actually working in Toronto, or in Vancouver, or even Calgary, right? You are taking credit for work you haven't done, which is all the applicants that you have, all the people you have access to, they're diverse not because you've actually sought them out, but because you are in the breadbasket of diversity, period. That to me is called diversity by default. And we are massive recipients of that grace at the University of Toronto. Where I want us to get to is inclusion by design, which asks the question, how do we look critically at our systems? How do we define competence? How do we actually ask the question, which stories are worth telling and which ones are actually worth elevating to the level of cultural content? Why do I say this? What's the problem with stereotypes again? The problem with stereotypes is not that they're actually not true. The problem with stereotypes is that they're actually incomplete. And when do we resort to stereotypes as human beings? When we're under a lot of stress. We quickly go to the heuristics and what's worked in the past. Yes? Okay. What do we call job interviews? Highly stressful situations. What happens when you have a deadline to meet and you have to get some sources? You got to get some people on air. Pretty darn stressful. You go to your reflexive ideas and experiences and you go to the same old, same old. Why is that important? So I'm about to show you my favorite cartoon from The New Yorker. It says one snail to the other, I don't care if she's a tape dispenser, I love her. So this is a phenomenon that I study at length on the 6th floor of the Rotman School. It's called homeophily, which is the tendency that we as human beings have to be attracted to people of like kind. There's nothing the matter with all the fan club of Farah sitting in the back together. Nothing the matter with that, right? But it does matter when in fact we let homeophily become the default setting on our cruise control. And why does that matter? Well, that matters to me because I think we forget what's actually happening behind the scenes. So dim the lights and go watch a movie. Have you seen this one? Looks familiar? Just kidding, just kidding. I want you to notice what's happening here. Daniel Ocean.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please state your name for the record.
Daniel Ocean.
Thank you. Mr. Ocean, the purpose of this hearing is to determine whether if released you are likely to break the law again. While this was your first conviction, you have been implicated, though never charged, in over a dozen other confidence schemes and frauds. What can you tell us about this?
As you say, ma'am, I was never charged.
So, what do you notice in that scene? That's true. Don't you see I'm going for that gray? Yeah. What else? I've seen this movie 6 times. I am Super Elite Honorary Canada after all. Quebec. Calm. Whose voice is that in the voiceover? This, to me, is the most important scene in the movie. A woman. Yeah. Who is she? Can you recognize her voice? I'll give you a little hint. you know what this is? That's Viola Davis. So Viola Davis actually has an uncredited, and I hope paid, but certainly uncredited, opening voiceover in Steven Soderbergh's kind of second best movie. Right, his first movie, the best movie in my view, is the one with Jennifer Lopez and, gosh damn it. No. We'll come to it. We'll come to it. Second best movie. So the reason I use this clip is to ask the question, what's our orientation for practice? We quickly look at the actor. We quickly look at who's on screen. We don't actually ask who's setting up this dialogue or this conversation. And oftentimes, our communities feel like that. We're the voiceovers that are called in to actually set up the play. We're always the bridesmaids and never the bride. And I think inclusion by design is asking the question, how can we stretch the value proposition that we have for diverse audiences, not simply as consumers of what we're producing, but actually co-creators and enablers of the culture that we're looking to recreate. Number 4, there's only 5, so it's good news. I think inclusion is about putting people at the center. To me, leadership work is people work. If you can't love them, you can't lead them. Asterisks. One more time. Leadership work is people work. If you can't love them, you can't lead them. Asterisks. So I'm not suggesting that you have to love everyone that you lead, but I am insisting that in everyone that we lead, there must be something that we love to see grow and to develop. But we can't actually see someone's potential if we see them as being less than. Let me tell you what less than also looks like. Less than also looks like, well, I don't see color, I don't see gender, I don't see race, I don't see sexual orientation. As I was zipping from 105 St. George to 123 Queen West, I quickly came in, I parked, and ran in, and I met with Farah. That's not the experience of my female colleagues. They would have to think about where they would park their car. Because if they're done with this event and it's dark, and they're on Queen Street West, where is a well-lit, secure, safe place for them to minimize the distance they would have to cover between this place and the car? I have no such issue. Fair? In fact, I'm walking by, people giving their car keys all the time. Hey, park my car, here's my Benz. And only partly kidding. And the reason I say this to you, right? The reason I say this to you is I actually think when we say we don't see difference, what we're saying is we're not interested in acknowledging the lived experiences and the ordinary privilege that we have. This is my favorite definition of leadership. Every morning I get up to have a shot of espresso at 4 o'clock so I can say his name right. His name is Jean-Piero Petrieri, a tongue twister of an Italian name. He's a friend of mine, he teaches at INSEAD, and he says leadership is about 4 enablers of 3 behaviors. It's about the courage. Inclusion takes courage to step out of our default settings. Next, it's about capacity. No one is born with it all. Thirdly, it's about curiosity. Effective and inclusive people are always thinking about, they're always curious about how others see the world differently, not similarly to themselves. And lastly, it's about commitment. Commitment is saying what you believe in and doing what you're going to be doing in keeping with that belief. How much credibility would we give leaders who say one thing and do another? Not much. Okay. How much credibility would we give organizations that claim one thing and do another? Not much. Well, watch that last response. Because all of our organizations have diversity statements. All of our organizations have a commitment to these ideals. And when we don't see ourselves or others don't see themselves reflected in our output, guess what happens? That dissonance sets in. So now here are the 3 behaviors. to work with. It doesn't matter how much of an all-star I am, or Farah is, or you are. If we don't have the ability to work with others, we're going to leave value, insight, and culture on the table. Secondly, to learn from. If we don't have the humility to learn from other people, how will we move our prototypes forward? And lastly, to give voice to the other. Okay, folks, who's the other in Jean-Pierre's definition? Give voice to whom? Who's the other? People not like us? Okay, nice, try. Others? Give me 5. No, proper 5. Yeah, anyone who's not us. And the reason the last thing is really, really tough to do is because it's so easy to just look at the world from our lenses. Lastly, I want to talk about this idea of cultural fluency, because to me, that's what giving voice to the other means. It begins with awareness, right, which is this idea that we understand where we have been informs how we see the world. Next, it's understanding. To say that others who have different experiences of the world see the world in different yet equally valid ways. And lastly, it's about skill. How do we create the skill set that we need to navigate these differences? The overlap of that is cultural fluency. I do not like the term cultural sensitivity. It's not about being sensitive, that smelly thing. I don't even like the term cultural competence, because to me it sounds too boastful. Here we are at the summit of cultural competence, and all of you down there are therefore incompetent. Too colonial for me. But the funny thing is, it's not new. This is Hippocrates, and this is the advice that he gave his medical students millennia ago. Observe the nature of each country, diet, customs, the age of the patient's speech, manners, fashion, even their silence. One must study all these signs and analyze what they portend. It's not new. It's not new. So what gets in the way? I don't care if she's a tape dispenser. I love her. Still the same thing. Lastly, we've got to actually get beyond being believers into being builders. I'm done with motherhood statements. I'm done with, kind of what's actually on the walls. I'm really interested in what's happening in the halls. And that's what people are looking for. What does that look like? What do you see here? A different hotel. But what do you see in this picture? Good. So what does that give you? Access. Good. Access, and the opposite of access is called security. Access to the one who has the key, and security against the ones who shouldn't actually have the key. Yes? What about now? What's the difference? What's the difference? Same thing, same functionality? Access and security? There's one more thing, at least, and that's this. So folks who actually have these programmable keys also have one more function, which is you actually have to take this key and you have to drop it into the docket for the lights to come on in the room. And when we leave our rooms, we take the key with us for access and security purposes and leave the room. And now what happens is the lights go down and the temperature setting goes to not the high blast heat or the high blast cooling. This has the additional function of twinning the sustainability goals of the hotel operators with the needs of the customers, which are access and security. That's my last point. We need to think about how do we empathize with our audiences in a way that we don't just see them as consumers, but see them as builders of our future work. Just to show you I'm not fully biased, I actually have a quote from a professor at UBC, right? Professor Thompson says the following about empathy. He says, empathy is the ability to experience and understand what others feel. Let's stop there. Why are we talking about feelings? Why is a professor from Rotman School of Management talking about feelings? Dan Goleman, who teaches psychology at Harvard, says the following. He says it's not only that feelings matter, feelings are what mattering is all about. Feelings are what mattering is all about. Let's go back to the tweet. royal baby leaves hospital. It left people feeling raw. For a lot of people, maybe not our generation, right? The marriage between the two finally shows that the House of Windsor has shaken off its old dandruff. When that sort of stuff happens, people are thrown back to a very colonial past in which anyone who's not Anglo-Saxon is seen as less than. Then he continues, while maintaining a clear discernment about your own and other person's feelings and perspectives. Many of us think that if we actually empathize, we're not allowed to have our own opinion. And that's just BS. And of course, by that, I don't mean bold statement. And this is why empathy is tough. Empathy is tough because it requires for us to hold in tension our beliefs and our values and open and be entertaining of other people's values and beliefs and feelings on an equal footing. Last slide. Empathy is not about lowering standards. Rather, empathy is about raising our acuity. A lot of times we have this misnomer that if we're empathetic, we're somehow letting in people with less qualification, less talent, less credibility, and so on and so forth. It's not true. The most commonly used expression for empathy is, metaphor, to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. What we have to do is this. We have to take our shoes off first to be effective. Because our shoes, our models, our training, our experiences, our organizational privileges get in the way of us doing our work well as inclusive leaders. Thank you very much. I don't have that strong a shoe game. I just don't. Plain guy, give me Prada and Ferragamo, I'm happy.
So Nouman, thank you. Thank you, first of all of you for staying here. And I know this is the last session today, I believe, and you all came, so thank you so much. And you were so energetic that nobody fell asleep, which was great. Yeah, and nobody snuck out that I saw, so that was fantastic. Thank you. So you've talked about a lot of things. Yeah, I know, I don't think that's true. But let me start off. You spoke about a lot of things, a lot of things that we speak about in our newsroom, but I want to bring it down to news, because I think that we have some unique challenges when it comes to unconscious bias, when it comes to inclusion and diversity. But first, I'm interested to know, because you work in this space, you're a consumer of news, what do you feel is the role of the media right now, I mean, in the kind of age we live in?
So in addition to informing, I think the role of the media is to create not equanimity of voice, but a range of voices, right? And the reason that a range of voices is important is because, as Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. I actually think that newsmakers and news deliverers are educators. I really mean this. And when we can actually create an openness to saying there's more than one perspective that's not only valid, even if it's not valid, it's worth hearing, that's when news is at its best. When you could go a little bit under the surface, right, and say, so everyone's talking about white supremacy and Christchurch and talking about a whole bunch of things. Where does that live in our communities? Where does that come from? Is it just someone who is stuck in the past from the Rust Bucket states? That's not true, by the way, right? What does that look like within the corporate elite? And allowing the listener, the viewer, the reader, the connectability between ideas, and lastly, to contribute to it. So I think news has a future if we think about the interactivity that various platforms offer it.
And what about a future in a place where consumers of news often consume stories that they agree with, that they identify with, and they might not click on stories that they think is the other or doesn't have that kind of experience in those echo chambers? What about that?
Look, self-selection bias is real, but I actually think that when you do stuff well here's my prediction. People are going to be attracted to you not because they agree with your perspective,
Right.
but because they like they enjoy the rigor with which you do stuff. There's people that I listen to not because I agree with them, but man, are they ever incisive. And then some others I watch just for comic relief.
Right. You spoke about unconscious bias, and I think that's a real important thing in news, but we also face deadlines in news. I think it's 11 million pieces of information come into our brain a second. We process 50 of them, and I think 7 of them actually stay with us.
Only 7.
7,
Sure.
right?
Yes.
Am I right with those numbers?
Come on, that was good.
So we're making these, as was mentioned in the video, those shortcuts in our brain, right,
Yeah.
to process. Now, imagine that, and then having a 5:30 deadline or 6 o'clock deadline for some of our reporters or earlier. How do we tackle that? How do we tackle these unconscious bias and kind of rewire our brains?
Yeah. So 2 things, actually 3. First, I want to again use a food analogy, right? If you want to correct how you eat, or you want to actually regulate how you eat, think about what you put around yourselves. Put fruit and dried fruit and nuts and kind of flaxy stuff, you'll eat reasonably well. If you put candy and popcorn and ice cream and all that chocolate stuff, not so much. We're going to reach for that which is accessible. So what I'm asking is, like, physically create pathways, right, to things you're going to reach for that are not the same old, same old. And when you do that, what happens is you actually rewire the neural passageways in our brain. Second thing I want to say is it's really hard, in fact impossible, to empathize with an idea. We can only really empathize with an experience. The best newsmakers are the ones who have a really wide repertoire of experiences, because they can pull in stories and make themselves relatable to the guest and put them at ease. Yes? We've got to do the same regularly.
Did you take that test that you were talking about?
I
you
did.
Take that? And what did you find? Would you mind sharing?
No, I don't mind sharing at all. It's kind of...
I want to take that test, yeah.
So I took the one on race.
Okay.
And what I found was I associate competence with light skin and incompetence with dark skin. That's my exact... you're way more polite. Auntie's sitting here. I'll tell you the whole story. So I text Mazrin, who's a friend of mine at Harvard, say, Mazrin, we're going to talk this weekend. Like, it's urgent. She's like, what, the baklava ran out? No, it's worse than that. So I took the association test, okay? And she said, I show this result. And she starts chuckling. She goes, okay, tell me about your background. Tell me about your educational background. High school, private English. First university, Princeton. Second university, U of T. Your bosses at IBM, at U of T. Have you ever had a non-white boss? No. Ever had a non-white headmaster, principal, dean, professor? Hardly. Here's the funny thing. When I took it on gender, I associate higher level of competence with women than I do with men. I've never had a male boss, ever. Wow. So all I'm saying to you, when I said to you this unconscious bias conversation isn't about you, it's about us, we're all actually susceptible to it because we all consume the same thing. The last thing I did want to say was this, on your question. I actually think that the emotional reaction we have when we have these kind of anvils land on our psyche is, what? And we have to have a different reaction, which is, I wonder where that's coming from, as opposed to, no, that's not me. And I think that takes practice. When cell phones first came on, the advice that people were given is practice doing 911 and hit send. Because people were doing 911 and not knowing how to hit send. Because at home, right, back when we actually had phones at home, right, you'd dial 911 and you'd be connected. When we first got mobile devices, we had to have one more additional tap, which is send. I'm saying inclusion requires one more additional tap, which is reach.
That's really interesting. I want to talk about something that might be a bit controversial in this room, because this room is full of media managers.
Good for it. Go for it.
But I think we have a real problem with media, and that is that we have diversity. There's a lot of me's, but there aren't a lot of people of color, specifically in management positions in any newsroom that I've ever worked in. And you saw today the tweet, I don't know if you all saw, but it was a tweet that came out of a panel that was held earlier today where it was Wendy and Ward Smith and a bunch of people who led their organizations, and somebody said, well, why couldn't you get people of color in leadership positions on this panel? You know, and I think the person didn't understand that this was actually the bosses of these organizations, so it's a little bit different. But they do make a point that we don't see these people in the positions, and I think one of the reasons is because, and this is across a lot of boards. I read a stat that 6.6% of partners in the GTA and law firms are people of color. 6.6% in the GTA, that's 50% visible minority. So it's obviously a problem across the board. But how do we kind of shift that mindset so that people who are grooming the next generation are not grooming people that they see themselves in, but people that they don't see themselves in?
So I have a view on this, which is quite simple. Why attribute to malice that which can adequately be explained by incompetence? One more time. Why attribute to malice that which can easily be explained by incompetence? I don't think that systems are malicious. Systems are just incompetent. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The way in which we define what competence or excellence or leadership looks like is reproducing what our earliest images of that have been. And it's really hard for us to veer away from that anchoring bias, which is very real. When I think about my very first year teaching, I don't know, 13 years ago, my very first class notes were like a replica of my freshman year class notes, because that's the anchor that I had in my mind. I actually think I've got a worse stat than that for you. When you look at the NYSE, the New York Stock Exchange, and you look at the top 50 firms, there are more CEOs named John than there are women. So if your name is John in the audience, you've won the lottery, the name lottery, right? And I want to say two things about that. Number one, you've got to actually ask the question, what are the criteria that we're actually looking for? And two, what are the ways in which we assess that criteria? For too long, the dominant practice has been around leadership. We want to hire for cultural fit. And I want to say to you, you need to actually hire for cultural contribution. Fit assumes that we want to continue with business as normal. Contribution asks the question, again, just like the key example, right? Key, the old key is fit. The new key, the remastered key, the programmable key, that's cultural contribution. It can have multiple factors associated with it. The second thing I want to say is we actually have to ask the question, what are some things that we're blind to? I really mean this. Farah, let me ask you an honest question. I'm flipping tables on
I have
you.
like every boss in my life in my room.
How many times have you been called to talk about diversity issues? I get 3 calls a day.
Yeah, I can't count.
Right?
Yeah, no, it's true, and I'm going to say this frankly. Like I even covering diversity issues, I'm tired. Like I wish there was other colleagues that I had who weren't people of diverse backgrounds who would cover some of these stories.
So my core area of work is teams and innovation. But I got called to so many, what I call them DANLs, diversity panels, right? I started to make diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias an area of interest for me because it actually has a big thing that connects it to teams. Now, I have the privilege of expanding my knowledge base. But you know what happens over time? You and I and others, right, and it's got nothing to do with race or gender, we get pegged as being the diversity gal or diversity dude or diversity them, and you just, it's the same thing. You just go for the closest person that's within reach. So the way we interrupt that is,
well, we get other people to do, but then there'll be criticism saying, well, this person is heading up a panel on diversity and they're not a person of color. How do they understand diversity as a person of color does, right?
The point I'm making is there are other people of color besides you and I.
Right, okay.
Maybe not here, but in the world, believe me. I've got pictures.
No, but it's true. I mean, this is, and I think but how do we concretely do it? I started 20 years ago in TV, and even then I remember the conversation. It was about women, and it was about diversity. Women,
Yeah.
I think we've made strides. Still, there's still ways to go. But
Yeah.
with diversity, it feels like things have not changed. I heard a former executive of ours say, maybe we need quotas. Like, what is needed
Yeah.
that,
So-
to make change here?
I'm not a fan of quotas, but I am a fan of targets. I'll tell you what the difference is. Targets are actually a throwback to a statement made in 1962 by a great psychologist, Canadian actually, Albert Bandura. So Bandura said in 1962, that which gets measured gets done. Asharaf said in 2019, not only is it true that that which gets measured gets done, that which gets measured gets gamed. So quotas get gamed all the time. Targets say the following. If you have a search for a producer, if you have a search for a host, you got to search for a researcher on your show. And if you don't have a slate that has at least 2 diverse candidates, that's a failed search. To me, that's a target. Now, you can start with a slate that's diverse and go and hire someone that's not diverse. At least the likelihood of you having considered someone is way higher. And where has this played out? In the NFL. The NFL actually has this around coaches. If you don't have an African American or a Latina coach in the mix, as you start your search, it's not on. So it requires a little bit of not just self-regulation, but asking the question, who's actually on your slate? The other way to do that, and it is my responsibility and yours, is we need to be in high schools talking about our work. You need to be talking to people who don't see themselves in front of the screen producing culture. I need to talk, the first thing I tell my undergraduates on the first day of class is I want you to know that I had 2 Fs in my freshman year at the end of year 1. And I'm a professor at the Rotman School of Management. And the reason I say that is not for them to lose all respect for me, that happens after the first session anyways, is for them to say, you too can actually overcome barriers. You too can challenge your own belief about self. So there's a part of you're not welcome that happens organizationally, but there's also a part of self-rejection that we have to challenge. That I am not good enough, pretty enough, smart enough, tall enough to do this work. And that requires for people like you and I to actually be ambassadors for the work with one asterisk. It's not about respectability politics. It's not about us saying that we're perfect. It's about us saying we hustled and you too should hustle. Or give it a shot.
There are people in media that have been there for a long time and who might feel like we are kind of hanging on to these inclusion threads, right? And some people who come from a background where they've been in a point of privilege, but now maybe feel threatened because they're not there anymore. Like they're, Johns, right? Johns. So some Johns might feel threatened.
Right.
So
not the ones on Jarvis, but the other Johns, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't even think about that. Yeah. So, I think that everybody should have a perspective. Like I really do. I really think we have to hear from everybody, and I don't think anybody should feel left out. But what do you say to people in that point of view, for that point of view?
Anyone here a runner? Anyone runs here? Yeah, I do too when I'm at a buffet. Yes. So when you're running, and you have a nice breeze right against your back, how does that feel? Nice. Right, that momentum, right? That's called a tailwind. So when you're running, you get a tailwind, it feels kind of nicer because you're going on a nice clip, and you get to the other end pretty quickly. What we don't realize is the other person who's running against that wind has headwinds. But when you see them, huffing and puffing and panting, we say, oh, they're out of shape. Oh my gosh, what a wuss. I want to talk about that in terms of just ordinary privilege. So I'm going to talk about myself for a moment. I come from a family where every single one of my siblings, there are 8 of us, we're too short of a football team, right, has a graduate degree. There are 2 professors in the family. My mom's a teacher, my dad's an investment banker, which means my dad said to me, whichever university you go to, I'll pay your full tuition. So what I did was got to Princeton, went there for the first year, got the 4-year tuition, transferred to U of T, kept the rest of the money. Early investor, right? So I had this privilege of never having to worry about OSAP or worrying about, student loan or not having to work, part-time when I was working. So when I have my cousins or my nephews and nieces who can't complete undergrad, I'm like, dude, it's an undergrad. What are you complaining about? I think that our tailwinds kind of make us feel that we have gotten all of where we've gotten to because of sheer hustle. So a lot of folks who are engaging in what you described, which I call majoritarian backlash, don't acknowledge the tailwind. And then what happens is we look at extreme examples of achievement and say, look, that person's black, and this person's a lesbian, and this person's Muslim, and they made it. You know what I say about those people? That's despite the headwinds. Imagine how much farther they would have gotten if they didn't have to deal with systemic exclusion. So my simple view is scarcity creates panic and fear. So when people actually start to see, oh my gosh, it's, you know, these other folks are getting opportunities and we're not, I'm going to say something that's actually controversial, but listen carefully. Be grateful that they're knocking on the doors, they meaning equity-seeking groups, and not knocking down the doors, which has happened in other societies. I actually think that my frame around this shifted about 14 years ago when Angela Davis came to U of T. And when she said, you know this thing that you call the civil rights movement? We never called it that back then. We called it the freedom movement. And the reason the difference is important is when you think of that as a civil rights movement, you got the Civil Rights Act. But discrimination didn't end there. The knock-on effects of slavery didn't end there. The multi-tiered status along race and whiteness didn't end there. And you've got to think about freedom. Last point on this. For those of us who actually have privilege, we have to understand that the openness to sharing privilege is the price of admission when it comes to doing the work of inclusion. If I didn't have mentors in my career, like Beatrix Dart, who said to me, Nouman, you're one of my top students, I want you to teach this global leadership course. I'm like, what, Beatrix? I've seen you do this. You can do this. I wouldn't be here today. That's Beatrix sharing her privilege. Roger Martin, who said to me, you're the guy to take integrative thinking across Canada and globally. That's sharing privilege. And I don't think they did it as an act of charity. They did it as an act of enablement because they could see what we couldn't see. So my advice to those people that feel threatened is to say, what do you see in others that you're not seeing in yourself? And have that conversation. Great question.
Thank you.
She did this for a living.
I want to talk to you about, and maybe you can expand on microaggressions, because we didn't talk about that. And I think that is something that sometimes happens in newsrooms. And I'd like you to talk about that a bit more.
Whatever, yeah.
Sorry? Whatever. That was good.
So microaggressions are death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, really, in the context of the office. And I think it's a terrific question because for many people, we say, well, no, they're just having a bad day. Well, they're just having a bad day when I'm around, it seems. Or the day just turned bad the moment I walked into the room. I have two comments on that. Number one, this is where allies are really important. This is where others who are privy to this behavior are really important. The behavior that we walk past is the culture that we are okay with. One more time. The behavior that we walk past is a culture that we're okay with within our respective organizations. If someone, says, oh my gosh, that gosh, you have just, by not saying anything or calling them out or noticing that that language is not acceptable about a colleague, just absolutely entrenched homophobia as being an acceptable part of your culture. And I'm not saying that you have to become the thought police or the PC police or all that nonsense, but I want to say that if I have a rapport with Farah, which I hope I do, right, and I hear her slip up and say, Farah, what was that, man? I didn't see that coming. Right. What's up with that? What am I missing? Not condemnation, but just curiosity, what's that about? Right? The flip side of that, around microaggressions, is allies need to engage in micro acts of courage. Which is to say, I said this to you earlier, to learn, to amplify, and to iterate. We need to amplify the voices of the ones who get talked over in meetings, the ones who get passed over for promotion, the ones who don't even get the recognition that you and I see them doing amazing stuff in. And I think those micro acts of courage are far more enabling than micro aggressions are disabling. Because then you go and you say, you know, tell me your name, sir. I love your tie, by the way. Tell me your name, please. Scott. Scott's got my back, right? And I feel that like Scott, like he stood up for me in a way that he amplified my point. It wasn't about getting credit or keeping score, but he took enough time to listen to what I had to say, and he brought that back up in the conversation. And I've been the beneficiary of that. I've seen others be the beneficiary of that. I have a rule when I hire research associates, right? We actually talk about asking this question, 2 questions. What do you need to be excellent? And what do you need for a culture to be safe for you? What do you need to be excellent? Define excellence for me. Because I said to them, you would not be here if I didn't believe you're capable of excellence. So what do you need? And 2, what do you need for this place to be safe for you? So you can bring your biggest badass self to work every single day. And this is where, you know what happens? Most people break down because they haven't been asked that by someone they look up to and someone who employs them. Think about this. These are graduate students, people with 5 to 10 years experience, and no one's ever asked them this question. What do you need to be excellent? And then we say, why are people so mediocre? Because when we ask them, what do you need to be excellent? So that's my point. They get out of the comfort zone. Microaggression right there. At least 3, at least. Solid questions.
I think that's just something that validation to people is so important and makes such a difference in how that experience shapes them. So, in the workplace especially, right?
Totally. Questions, please.
Back.
Oh, so toss it around.
We did earlier.
All
You
right.
got hit in the head.
I did.
Larry got hit in the head with the box. Actually, it's a soft box, so it wouldn't hurt. I want to pick up on the last thing that you just said about safe, and I think so what do you need to be excellent? Excellent. And then what do you need to feel safe here?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in that because there's an inference that the workplace is inherently unsafe.
It's not equally safe for everyone, no.
Because we had this conversation in the elevator here, because I wouldn't take Uber here because we don't have Uber in Vancouver.
Yes.
And as a female, when I travel,
Yeah.
I try to be very safe. And so I bizarrely feel like I'm not going to put myself in a stranger's car. And so I said to my colleague and another man in the elevator, women, we feel this in every elevator, in every parking garage, in every stranger's car we get into. But what is it about the workplace that is unsafe for some?
This idea that my ideas or my questions are legitimate.
So it's not personal safety.
It's not only personal safety. I'm actually talking about, so to me, safety is not a bubble. To me, safety is having permission to call out the status quo. To ask the question, Nouman, why do you always do it this way? Right, like what's the logic behind that? Mm-hmm. I think a great team is one in which the team members feel that they have the right to make undiscussables discussable, and the skills. And that requires for them to have 2 things. One is psychological safety, that no question is a bad question, and the second thing is accountability. Tell me why you're asking this question. What's the question behind the question? And for me, that's really important, because look, these students have far more to teach me than I have to teach them, right? So I need to actually make sure that I'm benefiting and the work is benefiting from all of their contributions. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, and the movie was Out of Sight.
Out of sight. Come on. Excuse me. That was good.
Oh, hang on.
Come on, Jill. Come on. Out of. Whoa, jeez.
Good throw.
Right here. The Raptors need you on Sunday. The Raptors need you. The 3-point game was weak in Philly. Good golly, that was like half court. Wow, I like that.
That's right.
Hashtag I'm down with that, yeah.
So can I ask you then?
And you are?
So I'm Meredith Delandria. I work for CBC. I lead teams, all the local programming teams in Quebec, the English programming teams. And what you were just saying there made me wonder then, how do you assess the unconscious bias of a work culture? Because I think that in news, we actually have taboos and unconscious biases. There are assumptions about what, how you're meant to be objective, which I always put in question marks because it is impossible, yet we have a practice and we have standards that help us get to that place. But there's an assumption that people in news shouldn't be religious. I think that's a taboo. We don't talk about it. Like, how do we uncover the biases that we have as a group and not only as individuals? Because that also forms our work culture.
Because we're also a cynical bunch, right?
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I actually think that it begins by creating opportunities to really understand what the employee experience is. I really mean that. Like, we can't assess what our unconscious biases are and how they trigger behaviors by ourselves. Marshall McLuhan, a great U of T grad, once said the following. He said, we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty certain it wasn't the fish. Right? So we're so caught up in our work that we can't see it from other ways of being. I actually think that new entrants into your organization have a particularly privileged view, which is they can call BS and they can actually tell you what they experience. And when I ask this question, what do you need to be excellent and what do you need to be safe? I also ask them, how are we failing you in those regards currently at U of T? So creating mechanisms for those things, I'm going to give you 3. Number 1, this idea of MBWA, managing by wandering around. Get the heck out of your office, right? 2, go to where innovation's happening. Don't just read the journals on innovation. Go and see where innovation's happening. And 3, this idea of actually learning from others. Invite people to have standing up meetings for 10 minutes a day, have three of those a day. That's only half an hour of your time, right? With people who actually annoy you. I'm serious. So I'm going to quote a U.S. president. I don't often get a chance to do that. Now, I'll say this without an accent, so you can't tell. Which U.S. president said the following? I don't like that man. Any guesses? Obama? I don't like that man, said Abraham Lincoln. And then he said, I must get to know him better. So the moment I have this reaction, like I don't like her or something about him turns me off, should be the trigger for us to lean in more and say, what about them? So have those stand-up coffee meetings 3 a day with people that you don't get. Yes, throw the white box. Thank you. Great question.
We've talked a lot about sort of insular cultures in our workplaces and our newsrooms.
Which are the norm, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also what we do is obviously communicate messages to a much wider audience. And Farah and I work very closely together, and we debate and talk about stories every day. And one of the most prominent conversations we've ever had that sticks out in my mind that maybe touched my unconscious bias was the day that Gord Downey was diagnosed with brain cancer. We had a conversation in the makeup room at Global about, we were going pretty much wall to wall with this story. And it was, we were touching on every angle. And I think our opening line was, this is the soundtrack to Canada. And Farah raised a question and said, is it though? Like, I don't know if I grew, I think you've reflected or cited sort of your own, you know the Tragically Hip, but it wasn't a soundtrack that you necessarily grew up with or that your friends.
Yeah, no, I went to a concert, but I was thinking like in Rexdale in those apartments. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think that was a soundtrack. That's not the soundtrack to their lives or
And so we try to maybe sometimes, especially in our business, we have to pick lead stories, or we have to have a story that's on the top of our website, or that's in the story carousel on our pages. And how do we choose the story that is most important to Toronto or Canada or Winnipeg on a particular day, while not being too narrowcast in how we decide what everybody is talking about?
Great question. I had that moment when John Candy died, and I grew up on John Candy stuff, and my gosh, I felt really bad. My friend's like, why? I'm like, dude, like Uncle Buck, he was Uncle Buck. I'm like, who the hell's Uncle Buck? And I think that, so congratulations, we're human, right? When we take our icons and extrapolate from them, from that they have iconic value to everyone, right? And forever. That's the other thing. So I actually think that we need to ask the question, what about, the Tragically Hip became so resonant? And we do this all the time. My respect to my CBC colleagues in the room, I hated the tagline, Canada lives here. No, it doesn't. You try to get to places where Canada lives. Like, don't be a chump, right? No, I'm serious. I think it's easy to make, bold claims. Instead, we need to ask the question, what is it that is universal about Gord Downie's experience? I actually think that Gord Downie, the activist, is far more relatable to me than Gord Downie, the musician, right? The secret path and thinking about the legacy and asking questions about what is the role of music in healing? And that's the one thing we didn't talk about around inclusion. When you're actually an inclusive leader, you understand your role as a healer, right? So, people who walk into our organizations have different experiences. And some of them are not particularly nice. My daughter, who's in second year university, of course, at U of T, says to me, she was working last summer at the Y, she's like, everyone's talking about going to the cottage. What's the deal with the cottage? Right? That's not our thing.
Yeah, that's my thing. CB24 would always say, if you're going north of the 400 on your cottage, I'm like, I don't have a cottage. You're making me feel bad. It's most people don't have cottages, but we say it all the time. Anyway, sorry.
When I go north, I'm going to go to that Mandazi place they told me about at Dixon and West. It's West. Okay, see, I'm a 416er. 905 is like, So that's the thing we're going to ask, right? So what are recreational activities? What are cultural connections? What are things that actually speak to that? I also think it has to do with this question of, what am I curious to learn? Like, a great story would be to talk to people who knew nothing about, right, that band. And say, what do you intuit about what this means to you? Who's going down into you, right? Terrific question. Thank you. I was throwing this thing around somewhere? Yeah. All right. Is it random?
Well, I don't want to.
Yeah, it's true. Oh my gosh, we're kind of out of time. Almost?
All right. I was gonna
10 minutes, 10 minutes. No, one more solid question. One more question. I said 3. Yes, please. And you are. Amber.
Especially you think, hey, we're doing great, and then you see the tweet about, the little baby Archie. Like, how do you stay optimistic about where we're going in inclusion?
Yeah, I'm a hopeaholic, Amber. And my secret sauce is to hang out with people that are younger than me, right? I like substantially younger than I'm 45, so I'm talking about people that are in teens and stuff like that. And the reason I say that is they don't see the boundaries that we do. They really don't. I'll give you a small example. This is one of the most moving experiences that I've ever had. It involves my daughter, Nasma, who is now in first year university at U of T. And she said to me about a year ago, she said, so-and-so, who's a close friend of hers, she has 3 close friends, one of her close friends, I just learned that she's cutting herself, right? So I'm just trying not to lose my cool as we're having dinner and trying to not choke on the biryani, right? And I said, oh, okay, yeah. So do you know why? Like, what's behind that? And she said, it's the craziest thing. I said, what's the craziest thing? She says she thinks that she's cutting herself because she thinks she's not beautiful. And she really struggles with this self-image stuff. I said, okay, Nasma, so what do you guys do? She said, all of us, all 4 of us, right? We got together and we said, A, we wouldn't lie to you, and we want you to know that you're beautiful. And even if you're not, you're beautiful to us. So we talked to her about it. And I was just so moved by that self-efficacy, right? Standing up for each other and not judging her, saying, oh my gosh, she's whack. Like, I'm not hanging out with her anymore. She's like crazy. We don't do this sort of stuff in our home. But she came to it from a place of empathy, not sympathy. And when Nasma was really struggling in the first year, yeah, welcome to U of T, right? Guess who was there for her? That friend who said, I know you're a strong girl. You'll do this. You've got this. That's what keeps me hopeful, right? Is that youngsters and people from communities that have next to nothing have solutions and have ideas and have community building. You know, the word in the Merriam-Webster word of 2017 was youthquake, right? I believe that the youthquake is real. If you think in the US, the most important social movements have been youth-driven, right? The average age of the Black Lives Matter protester is 7.8 years younger than the civil rights activists in the 50s and the 60s. The walkout of schools around gun violence, super young people. That's where the hope comes from for me. Thank you very much. You all have been a terrific, terrific, terrific crowd.
Thank you very much. It's I think your words and your charisma will last for a long time with many people in this room. So thank you, and thank you, everyone. And we're done. Well, we're not. We have the reception this evening, so we look forward to seeing you there. But we have a bit of a break.